I am Tessa, 29 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. They looked me dead in the eye and called my backyard wedding trashy. They laughed in my face and decided to toast the engagement of my sister on a luxury yacht that very same day. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to be the joke of the family. What they did not know was that the man I was marrying was a $24 billion tech chief executive officer. What they did not know was that their precious yacht party would end in handcuffs and humiliation on national television. While they were left stranded on the hot docks with absolutely nothing, I was walking down the aisle in a $150 million private estate. When my mother finally realized the brutal truth and texted me, begging to come inside, my reply was just two simple words: too late. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who constantly underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent Atlanta neighborhood meant keeping up appearances was everything to my parents, Brenda and Jerome. But inside our sprawling brick home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. I was the dependable one, the independent auditor who worked quietly while my younger sister Valerie was the undeniable golden child. She demanded the constant spotlight, and my parents gladly handed it to her without hesitation. That toxic dynamic followed us straight into adulthood and set the stage for the ultimate betrayal. It all reached a breaking point last month during our traditional Sunday dinner. The heavy mahogany dining room table was set perfectly with the finest vintage china of my mother. The rich smell of roasted chicken and savory collard greens filled the air, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. I was sitting directly across from Valerie and her brand new fiancé, Preston. Preston was a flashy, wealthy Wall Street finance broker who wore tailored Italian suits and loved to talk down to absolutely everyone in the room. My parents treated him like absolute royalty simply because he threw around fancy financial terms like hedge funds and offshore accounts. My fiancé Julian was sitting very quietly right beside me. Julian was exceptionally brilliant but deeply unassuming. He wore plain black cotton shirts and told my family he did freelance software engineering. My parents barely acknowledged his existence, treating him like the hired help. I took a deep, nervous breath and reached into my designer tote bag. I pulled out a thick stack of heavy cream-colored wedding envelopes. I passed them carefully around the table with a genuine, hopeful smile. I proudly told everyone that Julian and I had finally set a firm date. August 15th. I explained that we wanted to keep things very intimate and deeply meaningful. The invitation clearly stated that the ceremony would be held in the backyard of the home belonging to Julian, just outside the main city limits. There would be no grand hotel ballrooms and no flashy country clubs, just close, loyal friends and family gathering to celebrate our love. I foolishly thought they would be genuinely happy for me. I thought for once my family could just smile and say congratulations. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the large mahogany table. My mother Brenda picked up the elegant envelope and held it by the very corner as if it carried a contagious disease. She squinted critically at the elegant calligraphy and then dropped it carelessly back onto her expensive plate right next to her half-eaten cornbread. Valerie picked up her personal copy and let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed loudly against the crystal chandelier. She turned to Preston and smirked viciously. Preston leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair, crossing his arms arrogantly over his expensive Italian silk vest. He looked at Julian with a toxic mixture of misplaced pity and absolute disgust. Valerie carelessly tossed my beautiful wedding invitation aside like a worthless piece of junk mail. She clapped her manicured hands together and loudly announced that she actually had some incredibly exciting news of her own. She reached into her oversized, expensive designer handbag and pulled out a massive, glossy box tied perfectly with a shiny gold satin ribbon. She aggressively slammed it onto the absolute center of the table, landing right on top of my pristine wedding invitations. She looked me right in the eyes and beamed with a fake, sickeningly sugary sweetness. She proudly announced that she and Preston had just finalized the booking for their official engagement party. She boasted that they were renting a massive luxury mega yacht down at the prestigious city harbor. And then she dropped the ultimate devastating bomb. She declared that the yacht party was officially scheduled for August 15th, the exact same day as my long-planned wedding. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. I stared at her in absolute complete disbelief. I asked her why she would intentionally choose the exact same date when she fully knew I had been painstakingly planning this specific weekend for many long months. Valerie just flipped her perfectly styled blonde hair and sighed dramatically. She falsely claimed that the exclusive yacht was only available on that specific Saturday, and Preston simply had to have the absolute best. She casually said a simple backyard barbecue wedding could easily be moved to another random weekend. After all, it was just a basic backyard, right? She actually fully expected me to immediately cancel my own wedding day so everyone could comfortably attend her flashy engagement party on a rented boat. I looked over at my parents, desperately expecting them to finally intervene. Instead, my father was already eagerly opening the extravagant gold box from Valerie. The war had officially begun. My father pulled a massive crystal bottle of vintage champagne from the gold box, and his eyes practically widened with greedy delight. He held it up to the dining room light, as if it were a holy relic. Preston leaned back and casually mentioned that it was a $2,000 bottle he picked up during a recent business trip to Paris. My mother clasped her hands over her heart and looked at Preston as if he had just saved our entire family from ruin. She praised his success and his expensive taste loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. Then she slowly turned her sharp gaze toward me, and the entire temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Tessa, you are going to have to call your little vendors tomorrow morning and change your date." She said it not as a request, but as a direct command. She picked up her fork and went back to eating her chicken as if she had just asked me to pass the salt. I sat perfectly still and asked her why I should be the one to cancel when I had announced my date first. My mother let out an exhausted sigh and gave me that familiar look of profound disappointment. She told me I was being intentionally difficult and childish, just like I always was when it came to Valerie. She pointed her silver fork at me and said, "You have always been so unnecessarily competitive with your sister ever since you were little girls." She brought up how I refused to give Valerie the spotlight at my own high school graduation, and how I was always trying to overshadow her. It was pure gaslighting. Valerie was the one who had intentionally thrown a massive tantrum at my graduation because my grandparents bought me a car and not her. But in the twisted rewriting of history by my mother, I was always the villain, and Valerie was always the innocent victim. My father set the expensive champagne down and crossed his arms, looking at me with stern disapproval. He told me to be reasonable for once in my life. He explicitly stated that Preston had already paid a non-refundable deposit of $50,000 for the mega yacht. He looked at Julian and let out a short, condescending chuckle. He said, "No offense, Julian, but your little backyard gathering does not exactly have a strict cancellation policy. You guys are just throwing some folding chairs on the grass and calling it a day." My father actually said that right to the face of my fiancé. Julian gently placed his hand over mine under the table and gave it a reassuring squeeze. He did not look angry or defensive at all. He just looked completely unbothered, which only seemed to irritate my parents even more. My mother jumped right back in and aimed her venom directly at Julian. She put on a fake sympathetic voice and said, "We know you are doing your best, Julian, with your freelance computer repair jobs or whatever it is you do. We know the tech market is tough right now for independent contractors. But Preston is an established Wall Street executive, and he is providing Valerie with the lifestyle she truly deserves." She actually turned back to me and told me I should be grateful that Preston was bringing some real class into our family. She said this was a monumental networking opportunity for my father and his business associates. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "We are not going to skip the social event of the entire season just to stand in some dirt and watch you settle for a mediocre life, Tessa." The word "settle" hung heavy in the stifling air of the dining room. They were openly calling my life and my future husband a massive disappointment simply because we did not flash designer labels or brag about offshore bank accounts. I looked at Valerie, who was busy admiring her massive diamond engagement ring, completely ignoring the emotional wreckage happening right in front of her. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had intentionally chosen my wedding day, just to force my parents to publicly choose her over me once again. And they were doing exactly what she wanted without a single moment of hesitation. My father then boldly declared that family supports family, and if I truly loved my sister, I would happily move my tiny little ceremony to September or October. He warned me that if I stubbornly kept the August 15th date, neither he nor my mother would attend my wedding. He said they would not be caught dead missing the yacht party because it would be a massive insult to Preston and his powerful, wealthy friends. They were effectively threatening to boycott my wedding day unless I bowed down to the selfish whims of my sister and her arrogant fiancé. They expected me to easily fold and cry and beg for their approval, just like I did when I was a vulnerable little girl. But I was no longer that helpless little girl, desperately seeking validation from people who fundamentally could not love me. I looked at the faces of my mother and my father. I saw the harsh judgment and the shallow materialism that dictated their every single move. I saw how they worshipped Preston simply because he was a wealthy white man who threw money at them. I saw how they looked right past the incredible, brilliant, loving black man sitting next to me simply because he did not wear his immense wealth on his sleeve. I took a slow, deep breath and felt a strange sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. The toxic fog that had clouded my judgment for 29 years was finally lifting. I did not raise my voice, and I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at my mother and told her that my wedding date was absolutely non-negotiable. I told her the invitations were already printed and the venue was already fully secured. I said if they preferred to spend the day on a rented boat with a man who belittled our entire family, then they were completely free to make that choice. My mother gasped loudly, as if I had just slapped her across the face. Valerie finally looked up from her diamond ring and glared at me with pure hatred. Preston just sneered and shook his head, muttering something under his breath about how ungrateful I was. The battle lines were officially drawn right there over the roasted chicken and the vintage champagne. They had made their choice clear, and now it was time for me to make mine. I was going to let them walk right off the edge of their own arrogant cliff. The silence in the dining room was so heavy it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Valerie was still glaring at me, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table. My mother and father were visibly fuming, waiting for me to break down and apologize for ruining their perfect Sunday dinner. But I just sat there with my head held high, completely unbothered by their hostile stares. That was when Preston decided he needed to regain absolute control of the room. He let out a loud, arrogant sigh and reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored Italian suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook and a heavy gold-plated pen. He slowly unhooked the pen cap with a deliberate click that echoed in the quiet room. He began to write on the check with quick, aggressive strokes, making sure everyone at the table was watching his grand display of wealth. He ripped the check from the booklet and slid it across the polished wood, right over my pristine wedding invitations. It came to a stop just inches from my plate. I looked down and saw his messy signature at the bottom of a check written out for exactly $5,000. Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and gave me a condescending smirk. "Listen, Tessa," he said in a voice dripping with fake pity. "I know things are tight for you and Julian. It is hard trying to build a life when your partner is just scraping by with odd computer jobs. Take the money. Go find a decent hotel ballroom, or at least a country club that is not fully booked. Buy yourself a proper dress and hire a real caterer. Do not embarrass this family by making your parents sit in some cheap folding chairs in a dusty backyard. Consider it an early wedding gift from Valerie and me." My mother gasped in absolute delight, clapping her hands together. She looked at Preston as if he were a saint who had just descended from heaven. "Oh, Preston, that is incredibly generous of you," she gushed, turning to look at me with a victorious sneer. You see, Tessa, this is what real family does. You should be on your knees thanking him for saving you from making a complete fool of yourself. Valerie crossed her arms and smiled smugly. You really should take it, Tessa, she added in a sugary sweet tone. I would honestly be mortified if my friends saw pictures of me attending a wedding that looked like a cheap neighborhood barbecue. I did not touch the check. I did not even flinch. I simply looked at the $5,000 and then slowly shifted my gaze up to Preston. His arrogant smirk faltered just a fraction under my unwavering stare. Julian sat quietly beside me. His posture relaxed but his eyes completely focused. He knew exactly what I was about to do. I reached out with one finger and deliberately pushed the expensive piece of paper back across the table until it stopped right in front of the empty plate Preston was using. I appreciate the gesture, Preston, I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. But Julian and I are doing just fine. We do not need your charity to fund our wedding. Besides, I would feel incredibly guilty taking money from your hedge fund right now. Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes. Please, Tessa, $5,000 is basically pocket change to me, he bragged, leaning back in his chair. Do not let your stubborn pride ruin your one special day. I tilted my head slightly and offered him a very cold, very calculated smile. It is not about pride, Preston, I said softly, keeping my eyes locked dead on his. It is just that as an independent auditor, I tend to keep a very close eye on market trends. And from what I have been hearing in certain financial circles, your specific fund has been making some rather reckless short-selling moves lately. The room remained dead silent, but the atmosphere instantly shifted. The smug confidence completely vanished from the face of Preston. I leaned in just a little closer and lowered my voice just enough to make him strain to hear me. In fact, I continued casually. I read a very interesting confidential brief recently. Rumor has it the Securities and Exchange Commission has been looking very closely into some highly irregular offshore transfers connected to your primary portfolio. I imagine every single dollar is going to count when the federal investigators finally freeze those assets. I really could not burden you by taking your money right before a massive federal audit. The color rapidly drained from the face of Preston, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. His jaw went slack, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he expected federal agents to burst through the dining room windows right then and there. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly above his expensive silk tie. How do you... He stammered, his voice suddenly high and tight. What are you even talking about? You are just a low-level accountant. I am an independent corporate auditor, Preston. I corrected him smoothly. People talk. Numbers leave a trail. And I am remarkably good at reading both. My parents and Valerie looked wildly confused. They did not understand the complex financial jargon I had just casually dropped onto the dinner table. All my mother heard was that I was insulting her precious future son-in-law and rejecting his generous handout. Tessa, how dare you speak to Preston that way? My mother shrieked, her face turning a deep shade of angry red. He offers you a fortune out of the goodness of his heart, and you attack his business with ridiculous lies. You are a bitter, jealous girl, and you are completely ruining this entire family. My father slammed his fist on the table, rattling the vintage china. Apologize to him right now, Tessa, he demanded loudly. But Preston did not look like a man who wanted an apology. He looked like a man who was desperately trying to calculate how much time he had left before his entire fraudulent empire collapsed around him. His hands were actually shaking as he quickly grabbed the check, crumpled it into a tight ball, and shoved it back into his pocket. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. Julian immediately stood up right beside me, standing tall and solid like an immovable wall. I calmly picked up my designer tote bag and smoothed down the front of my dress. There will be no apologies today, I said, looking around the table at the people who were supposed to love and protect me. I gave you my invitation. My wedding is on August 15th. If you choose to spend that day on a rented yacht with a man who is currently sweating through his custom suit, then I wish you nothing but the best. I turned to Valerie, who was still staring at me with a mixture of confusion and pure rage. Congratulations on your engagement, Valerie, I said evenly. I genuinely hope it brings you everything you deserve. Without another word, I turned around and walked out of the heavy mahogany dining room. Julian walked right beside me, his hand gently guiding the small of my back. We did not rush. We did not run away. We walked out the front door with quiet, unshakable dignity, leaving my toxic family screaming and arguing in the background. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind us, stepping out into the cool evening air, I knew there was no going back. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. I walked down the long brick driveway of my childhood home, feeling lighter than I had in 29 years. The heavy burden of constantly trying to please people who were committed to misunderstanding me had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Julian unlocked the passenger door of our modest sedan, and I slid inside, letting out a long, slow breath. He got into the driver's seat and turned to look at me, his dark eyes full of quiet admiration and deep love. "You handled that perfectly," he said softly, reaching over to take my hand. His palm was warm and steady, grounding me after the chaotic storm we had just left behind. "They are going to try to destroy us," I warned him, looking back at the large house that was still completely lit up from the inside. "My mother will not let this go. Valerie is going to make it her personal mission to ensure my life is a living hell between now and August 15th. Julian just smiled a slow, dangerous smile that completely transformed his usually mild demeanor. "Let them try," he whispered, leaning in to kiss my forehead. "They have absolutely no idea what is coming." I leaned my head back against the car seat as Julian pulled out onto the quiet suburban street. My mind was already racing, anticipating the vicious attacks my family would undoubtedly launch in the coming days. They thought they held all the power. They thought they controlled the narrative because they had the loud voices and the fake money. But true power is entirely silent. True power does not need to scream at a dinner table or throw crumpled checks to prove it exists. As we drove away into the night, the image of the panicked face of Preston was burned into my memory. He knew his clock was ticking, and I knew that when August 15th finally arrived, my family was going to experience a reckoning they would never, ever forget. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating relentlessly against the wooden nightstand. It was barely 6 in the morning, but my screen was already lit up with dozens of bright notifications. I sat up in bed and blinked against the harsh light of the screen. There were over 40 unread text messages and a massive flood of Instagram alerts. Julian stirred beside me, wrapping a warm, heavy arm around my waist, but I pulled away slightly to open the very first notification. Valerie had wasted absolutely no time executing her calculated smear campaign. She had posted a perfectly staged photo of herself, sitting on the edge of her luxury bed, looking tragically beautiful, with a single artificial tear rolling down her cheek. Preston was strategically placed in the background, looking deeply concerned, and holding her hand with a protective grip. The caption beneath the photo was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation and weaponized victimhood. She wrote a long, dramatic essay about how her heart was completely shattered because her own sister was trying to maliciously sabotage the happiest time of her life. She explicitly claimed that I was bitterly jealous of her relationship with a highly successful white man and that I had deliberately chosen her engagement weekend just to steal her spotlight. She painted a completely false narrative where she had kindly offered to help pay for my wedding, but I had supposedly thrown the money back in her face out of pure spite and deep-seated insecurity. She ended the long post by saying she was praying for my bitter heart and desperately hoping I would find some peace. The comments section was an absolute dumpster fire of toxic extended family members rushing blindly to her defense. Aunt Denise wrote a lengthy comment saying that I had always been a deeply insecure girl who could never stand to see my younger sister shine. Cousin Leroy chimed in, saying it was truly pathetic how I was trying to drag Valerie down just because Julian could not afford to give me a real wedding. They were publicly tearing me apart based on a completely fabricated story, and Valerie was actively liking every single hateful comment to fuel the fire even more. Then I opened my private text messages. They were infinitely worse because my relatives did not have to hide behind the polite filter of public social media. My Uncle David sent me a massive paragraph calling me a total disgrace to the family name. He said I should be deeply ashamed of myself for attacking the financial business of Preston at the dinner table out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. He accused me of trying to ruin the valuable networking connections that Preston was bringing into our family. My older cousin Jasmine sent a barrage of aggressive texts telling me I was embarrassing the entire family by acting like a jealous, bitter stereotype. She said I needed to call Preston and apologize immediately before he decided to cut our family off from his immense wealth and social circles. She actually told me that Julian was probably ashamed of me for acting so petty and that I was lucky Julian was even willing to marry me in a cheap backyard. Reading those cruel words felt like taking a series of heavy physical blows directly to the chest. These were the people who had watched me grow up. These were the aunts and uncles who had sat at my college graduation and eaten food at my dinner table for years. And yet they did not hesitate for a single second to believe the absolute worst about me. They did not bother to pick up the phone and ask for my side of the story. They simply bowed down to the golden child and worshipped the wealthy white man she had brought into their orbit. Julian sat up slowly and gently took the phone right out of my shaking hands. He read through the vicious messages, his jaw clenching tightly with quiet, protective anger. He did not shout or curse or act impulsively. He simply locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the bedside table. He looked deep into my eyes and asked if I wanted him to step in and shut them all down right then and there. He had the power to do it. With one simple phone call to his legal team, he could have exposed the impending bankruptcy of Preston and publicly humiliated Valerie in the financial press. But I slowly shook my head. I told him no. I told him that responding to their toxic chaos would only give them the sick, twisted satisfaction of knowing they had successfully hurt me. Valerie desperately wanted a public screaming match. She wanted me to defend myself in the Instagram comments so she could twist my words and look even more like a helpless, bullied victim. I was absolutely not going to play her desperate game. Instead, I got out of bed and opened my laptop. I created a brand new folder right on my desktop and labeled it very simply. I took meticulous digital screenshots of every single Instagram comment, every hateful text message, and every direct threat to boycott my wedding. As an auditor, I knew the undeniable critical value of keeping strict receipts. I saved the long, rambling text from Aunt Denise where she explicitly stated she would rather die than attend my trashy backyard wedding. I saved the cruel message from Cousin Leroy, where he mocked the career of Julian and called him a broke loser. I archived the entire Instagram post of Valerie, including the exact timestamp and every single like from our relatives. I was deliberately building a solid, impenetrable wall of evidence for the day they would inevitably try to crawl back into my life. It was a deeply painful process to document my own family abandoning me. With every screenshot, I was effectively severing the emotional blood ties to my extended relatives. I was accepting the harsh, cold reality that I did not have a supportive village behind me. I only had a group of shallow people who valued the loud illusion of wealth and proximity to whiteness significantly more than they valued actual loyalty and unconditional love. But surprisingly, the pain was also incredibly liberating. I realized I no longer had to pretend to like these toxic people. I no longer had to send them obligatory birthday gifts or force awkward, polite smiles at tense holiday gatherings. They were voluntarily removing themselves from my life and saving me the trouble of doing it myself. I calmly closed the laptop screen and walked into the bathroom to start my day. I looked at my own reflection in the mirror and took a deep, steadying breath. Valerie honestly thought she had completely destroyed me by turning the entire family against me overnight. She thought the severe social isolation would easily break my spirit, force me to cancel my wedding, and make me beg for their collective forgiveness. But she had severely miscalculated my internal strength. She had spent her entire life heavily relying on the constant validation of our parents, while I had spent my entire life learning exactly how to survive completely on my own. I walked back into the bright bedroom and smiled at Julian. I told him we needed to finalize the luxury catering menu for our $150 million backyard. The pathetic smear campaign of Valerie was just fading white noise now. The final countdown to August 15th was officially running, and I was perfectly content to sit back and let them dig their own shallow graves on social media. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang again, breaking the quiet concentration in my office. This time, it was not a frantic text message or an angry Instagram notification from a distant relative. The caller ID simply said, "Dad." I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, watching it buzz relentlessly against my sleek glass desk. Julian was sitting across the room quietly reviewing some highly confidential legal documents for his upcoming initial public offering. He glanced up from his paperwork and gave me a very subtle, reassuring nod. I took a deep breath, swiped the screen, and pressed the phone to my ear. I answered and said, "Hello, Dad," keeping my voice entirely neutral. There was no warm greeting on the other end of the line. My father cleared his throat loudly, adopting that harsh, authoritative tone he always used when he was about to deliver a severe punishment to a disobedient child. "Tessa," he began coldly, "I am only calling to inform you of a final decision your mother and I have made regarding your recent unacceptable behavior. Since you have chosen to be incredibly stubborn and deeply disrespectful to Preston, we are officially pulling all financial support for your wedding. We will not be contributing a single dime to that backyard disaster you are planning." I almost laughed out loud right then and there. The absolute absurdity of his empty threat was truly staggering. My father had never offered to pay for a single thing in the first place. From the very moment I announced my engagement, he had made endless empty excuses about how his business funds were tied up, or how he was aggressively saving for the future wedding of Valerie. Julian and I were fully funding our own massive exclusive event without a single penny of their help. But my father honestly believed that officially withdrawing his imaginary financial support was going to utterly destroy my modest plans and bring me crawling back to him in desperate tears. He truly thought I was heavily relying on his non-existent charity just to survive. I replied smoothly, leaning back in my leather office chair, and told him that I completely understood. I calmly explained that Julian and I already had the entire budget fully covered anyway, but I thanked him for letting me know his final decision. There was a long, awkward pause on the line. My father was clearly expecting me to panic. He expected me to beg for his help and apologize profusely for my terrible behavior at the dinner table. When I did not give him the hysterical, dramatic reaction he desperately wanted, his voice grew even colder and much more demanding. "Well, since you are so remarkably independent now," he continued sharply, "there is another major matter we need to resolve immediately. Valerie is hosting an incredibly important engagement party on a luxury yacht. Preston has invited several high-profile Wall Street investors and elite members of society. Valerie needs to look the part. She needs to look like she comes from a family of substantial legacy and real wealth to impress his affluent friends." I could feel a tight, heavy knot forming in my stomach because I knew exactly where this twisted conversation was going. "I want you to bring over the vintage diamond necklace that belonged to your grandmother," he demanded flatly. "Valerie is going to wear it for her engagement photos and for the yacht party. It is the only piece of fine jewelry we have that matches the immense value of her new diamond engagement ring." My grip tightened fiercely on the phone. The heirloom diamond necklace was the only thing my grandmother had ever left entirely to me. She had explicitly written it into her legally binding will before she passed away because she knew exactly how greedy my mother could be. She knew my mother would immediately try to snatch it and hand it straight to Valerie, simply because Valerie was the favored golden child. My grandmother was the only person in that cold, empty brick house who ever truly saw me. She was the only one who ever actually loved me for exactly who I was, rather than what I could do for the family image. Giving that beautiful vintage necklace to Valerie to use as a cheap, flashy prop to impress a fraudulent white finance broker was a massive, unforgivable insult to the loving memory of my grandmother. I reminded my father that he knew perfectly well that Grandma left that specific necklace to me, and I kept my tone perfectly even, despite the intense anger boiling inside my chest. I told him it was legally mine and that it was not a shared family accessory for Valerie to borrow, just to show off to the wealthy friends of Preston. My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He told me not to start quoting legalities to him. He claimed that my grandmother was clearly confused in her final months, and that everyone in the family knew that the expensive necklace should have automatically gone to the eldest daughter of my mother. He boldly stated that Valerie was the one marrying into real money and elevating the social standing of our entire family. He actually told me I was throwing my life away on a freelance computer guy in a dirt backyard, so I did not need to wear a priceless vintage diamond just to stand around on the grass. The sheer cruelty of his words was breathtaking. He was completely dismissing my worth, my entire marriage, and the dying wishes of his own mother, just to pacify the endless greed of Valerie. He genuinely believed that because Valerie had successfully secured a rich white fiancé, she was inherently entitled to every single valuable asset our family possessed. He threatened me, saying that if I truly wanted to be a part of the family moving forward, I would hand over that necklace today. He told me to consider it a mandatory apology for the horrible way I treated Preston at the dinner table. He claimed Valerie was very stressed because of my selfish little stunts, and she deserved this heirloom to make her day completely perfect. I looked across the room at Julian. He was watching me closely, his dark eyes filled with silent, unwavering support. An incredible idea began to form in my mind. An idea so perfectly calculated that it would permanently shatter the fragile, arrogant reality Valerie had built for herself. I did not need to scream at my father or cry and explain why I deserved the precious necklace. I just needed to let them fall directly into their own trap. I let out a soft, defeated sigh, acting exactly like the broken, compliant daughter he fully expected me to be. I told him he was right, and my voice was completely devoid of any real emotion. I said that Valerie should absolutely have exactly what was inside the original velvet jewelry box because it truly belonged at her grand engagement party. I heard a sharp exhale of pure relief and smug satisfaction on the other end of the line. My father thought he had finally broken me. He thought his harsh financial threats and emotional manipulation had successfully forced me into complete submission. He told me he was glad I was finally acting like a rational adult, and his tone instantly shifted from aggressive to deeply patronizing. He ordered me to drop it off at the house this evening because Valerie was going out for a dress fitting and wanted to match the diamonds to her expensive outfit. I replied smoothly that I was actually heading to the upscale downtown area for a catering meeting this afternoon. I told him to have Valerie meet me at the luxury coffee shop on Fifth Avenue at exactly 3:00. I insisted I would hand the jewelry box directly over to her in person in a public place, so there would be absolutely no confusion and no false accusations later. My father snapped back, telling me not to be late because Preston had a very tight schedule, and Valerie did not have time to wait around for me. He hung up the phone without even saying goodbye. The line went dead, leaving a heavy, echoing silence in my quiet office. I slowly lowered the phone and looked down at my left hand. Resting perfectly on my ring finger was my stunning wedding band, intricately custom designed by Julian. And sitting right in the absolute center of that beautiful custom band, completely legally repurposed and shining brilliantly under the bright office lights, was the massive vintage heirloom diamond that had once belonged to my grandmother. Julian walked over and gently rested his hands on my shoulders, looking down at the spectacular diamond gleaming on my finger. He softly asked if my father had demanded the necklace, while a knowing smile played on his lips. I told him yes, and I felt a sudden rush of cold, thrilling anticipation. I told Julian I promised to give Valerie exactly what was left inside the box. I calmly closed my laptop and stood up, grabbing my designer coat because it was officially time to go meet my sister for coffee. The luxury coffee shop on Fifth Avenue was exactly the kind of pretentious establishment my sister lived for. It featured soaring glass windows, white marble countertops, and overpriced lattes. I arrived early and chose a small table in the center of the room. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the massive windows, creating a warm spotlight where I was sitting. I ordered a simple black tea and placed the faded navy blue velvet jewelry box in the middle of the marble table. Valerie was predictably late. She pushed through the heavy glass doors at 3:15 carrying large shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. She wore ridiculous oversized dark sunglasses indoors and scanned the room with a look of extreme superiority. She marched over to my table, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She dropped her bags onto the empty chair and collapsed into her seat, crossing her arms. "You are lucky I even had time to meet you," she snapped, pulling off her sunglasses. "Preston has me running all over the city preparing for this yacht party, and I still have a fitting for my custom gown in 30 minutes. So let us make this quick. Tessa, just hand over the necklace and I will be on my way." She simply demanded the heirloom like it was her birthright. I did not say a single word. I simply reached out and tapped the faded velvet box sitting between us. Valerie let out a greedy gasp, and her eyes lit up. She grabbed the box, pulling it eagerly toward her chest. "Dad told me you were throwing a massive fit about giving this up," she said with a smug, victorious sneer. "But I am glad you finally realized who actually deserves to wear the family diamonds. It is going to look stunning with the neckline of my engagement dress." She pressed the golden latch on the front of the antique box. The velvet lid popped open. Valerie looked down into the box, and her smug smile instantly froze. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She aggressively poked her finger inside, pushing aside the white silk lining. There was no massive vintage diamond catching the light. The only thing resting inside the velvet box was a neatly folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Where is the necklace, Tessa? Did you forget to put it in the box?" I took a slow, calm sip of my black tea. "I did not forget anything, Valerie," I replied, my voice perfectly even. "Dad told me to give you exactly what was left inside the antique box." So I did. Valerie frantically ripped open the folded piece of paper. Her eyes darted back and forth across the thick page. It was the official legal appraisal and certificate of ownership. It explicitly named me as the sole legal owner of the diamond per the finalized will of our late grandmother. "This is just stupid paperwork," she hissed, slamming the certificate down. "I need the actual necklace for my fitting. Where is it?" I rested my elbows on the marble table and leaned forward. I slowly lifted my left hand and rested my chin on my fingers, making sure the back of my hand was fully exposed to the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The massive vintage diamond set, perfectly in the center of my custom platinum wedding band, caught the bright light and sent blinding flashes of brilliance across the table. Julian had hired a master jeweler to extract the family stone and reset it into a modern, elegant ring that I could wear every single day of my life. Valerie stared at my left hand, and the color completely drained from her face. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. She looked from the empty velvet box to the legal appraisal, and finally back to the massive diamond shining on my finger. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "You did not," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute shock and rising fury. "Tell me you did not destroy the family heirloom for your trashy little backyard wedding." "I did not destroy anything, Valerie," I said calmly, lowering my hand. "Grandma left the diamond to me. It belongs to me. Julian and I simply had it permanently reset into my wedding band last week. It is legally mine, and now it is physically attached to my marriage. You cannot borrow it, and you certainly cannot use it to impress Preston." For a few seconds, Valerie just sat there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. She had promised Preston a priceless family heirloom. Now she had absolutely nothing but an empty velvet box. And then the golden child completely lost her mind. "You selfish, vicious, bitter witch!" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. She slammed both of her hands down on the marble table so hard that my teacup violently rattled against the saucer. "How dare you steal my moment? That diamond belongs to me. You are just trying to ruin my engagement because you know Julian is a broke loser and Preston is 10 times the man he will ever be." The entire coffee shop went dead silent. The baristas stopped steaming milk. The wealthy patrons lowered their laptops and stared openly at our table. Valerie did not care that she was making a massive public spectacle. She stood up, knocking her heavy metal chair backward so hard it crashed loudly onto the concrete floor. "Give me the ring," she demanded, reaching aggressively across the table and trying to grab my left hand. "Take it off right now and give it to me, or I swear to God I will call the police and tell them you stole it." I swiftly pulled my hand back out of her reach and stood up, smoothing down the front of my designer coat. I looked around at the dozens of shocked faces watching us, and then looked back down at my sister, who was now breathing heavily and shaking with uncontrollable rage. "Call the police, Valerie," I challenged her, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "Show them the legal appraisal sitting right there on the table. Show them the will. Please make a massive scene. I am sure Preston and his elite Wall Street friends will absolutely love reading about his unhinged fiancée throwing a violent temper tantrum in the middle of a cafe over jewelry she does not even own." Valerie let out a sound of pure primal frustration. She grabbed her iced latte from the edge of the table and blindly hurled it in my direction. I stepped back just in time and the plastic cup smashed against the floor, sending a huge wave of milk and ice crashing across the expensive shoes of a woman sitting at the next table. Gasps erupted across the room. A manager in a black apron immediately started rushing over from the front counter. I looked at Valerie one last time. Her expensive designer clothes were splattered with drops of coffee. Her face was red and blotchy. She looked absolutely deranged. "Enjoy your fitting, Valerie," I said quietly, picking up my purse. I turned around and walked calmly toward the glass exit doors, leaving her standing in a literal puddle of her own toxic mess. My phone started buzzing furiously in my pocket the moment I stepped onto the sunny sidewalk, but I did not even bother looking at the screen. The trap had worked flawlessly. Valerie had humiliated herself in public, and there was absolutely no way she could spin this to make me look like the bad guy. The warm afternoon sunlight of Fifth Avenue felt incredibly refreshing on my face as I walked away from the luxury coffee shop. I could still hear the muffled sounds of the chaotic scene I had just left behind, but I did not turn around to look. My phone was vibrating continuously in the deep pocket of my designer coat. I knew it was likely my father furiously calling to demand an explanation, or perhaps Valerie frantically texting me a stream of unhinged threats. I simply ignored the constant buzzing and kept walking toward the parking garage where I had left my car. My heart was beating in a steady, calm rhythm. For the first time in my entire life, I had stood my ground against the golden child without shedding a single tear or feeling an ounce of misplaced guilt. I was only about half a block away from the coffee shop when a massive black luxury SUV suddenly swerved toward the curb right next to me. The dark-tinted windows and the aggressive way it stopped made me pause on the busy sidewalk. The heavy passenger door swung open violently, and Preston stepped out onto the concrete. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, but his face was completely flushed with dark red anger. He slammed the heavy car door shut and marched directly into my path, physically blocking me from continuing down the busy street. Valerie had clearly called him the absolute second I walked out of the cafe, spinning a wild, exaggerated tale of how I had violently attacked her and stolen her precious family diamonds. "You really think you are so incredibly smart?" "Do you not, Tessa?" he snarled, stepping dangerously close to me. He was trying to use his height and his broad shoulders to physically intimidate me right there in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. "Valerie is inside that cafe right now, hyperventilating and completely covered in spilled drinks because of your sick, jealous little stunts. You actually think you can humiliate my future wife and just walk away without any consequences?" I did not take a single step back. I stood my ground and looked him directly in his angry eyes. Valerie humiliated herself. "Preston," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice at a low conversational volume so the passing pedestrians would not stop and stare. She threw a massive temper tantrum in a public place because she finally realized she cannot always get everything she demands. The diamond legally belongs to me, and it is currently sitting on my left hand. If you wanted her to have a bigger ring, you should have just bought her one with all that imaginary money you keep bragging about. The muscle in his jaw twitched violently. My words had hit a very sensitive nerve. Preston absolutely hated being reminded that his financial facade might not be as rock-solid as he desperately portrayed it to be. He let out a harsh, arrogant laugh that sounded completely hollow. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with," he spat, pointing a manicured finger right at my face. "You think your little backyard wedding and your fake legal papers make you powerful? You are nothing but a bitter, lonely girl who is about to learn exactly what happens when you cross real money and real influence." He crossed his arms over his expensive suit and a sickeningly smug smile spread across his face. "You know, I was going to just let your pathetic little wedding happen," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I was going to let you have your miserable day in the dirt. But after what you just did to Valerie, I decided to make a few quick phone calls on my way over here. I decided to completely buy out the absolute last shred of loyalty your family had left for you." I kept my face perfectly blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "What exactly did you do, Preston?" I asked flatly. "I just purchased 30 round-trip first-class plane tickets for your entire extended family," he boasted proudly, puffing out his chest. "Every single aunt, every single uncle, and every single cousin, who was even slightly on the fence about attending your little backyard barbecue. I booked them all luxury suites at the Four Seasons right near the harbor. I paid for everything in full. Your parents have already called them all to confirm the exciting news. You see, Tessa, money buys loyalty, and I have enough money to make sure every single person you share blood with chooses my yacht party over your pathetic dirt patch." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch and strong mints. He wanted to see me break. He desperately wanted to see the tears well up in my eyes. "I promise you, Tessa," he whispered maliciously, "you are going to walk down that cheap little aisle completely alone. There will be no family sitting in those folding chairs. Your father is not going to walk you down the aisle, and your mother is not going to be there to fix your dress. You are going to be completely abandoned, and everyone in this city is going to know that your family chose my wealth over your existence." He waited for the crushing weight of his ultimate ultimatum to completely destroy me. He expected me to crumble right there on the concrete sidewalk. He expected me to beg him to cancel the flights or plead with him to leave me just a few family members. Instead, a slow, deliberate smirk crept onto my face. I looked at the arrogant white finance broker standing in front of me, and I felt nothing but profound, absolute pity. He thought he had just dealt me a fatal blow. He had no idea that he had just handed me the greatest gift I could have ever possibly asked for. He had voluntarily removed every single toxic relative from my sacred space, and he had paid for the immense privilege of doing it. I tilted my head slightly and smiled a genuine, radiant smile. "That is incredibly generous of you, Preston," I said softly. "You just saved me thousands of dollars on expensive catering for people I do not even like. I genuinely hope you and my family enjoy every single second of that luxury yacht party. I really hope you soak in all the wealthy, important guests and the expensive champagne. Because days like that are very fleeting, especially in your current line of work." The smug confidence on his face faltered for a brief second. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to read the hidden meaning behind my calm words. "You are bluffing," he muttered, his voice losing a tiny fraction of its aggressive edge. "You are just trying to act tough because you know you have absolutely nothing left." I stepped around him casually, brushing past the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit. "I have everything I could ever possibly need." "Preston," I called back over my shoulder as I continued walking toward my parking garage. "Make sure your phone is fully charged on August 15th. You are going to be receiving some very important phone calls." I did not look back again. I walked into the dark, cool interior of the parking garage and unlocked my car. As I slid into the driver's seat, I finally pulled my phone out of my pocket. There were 12 missed calls from my mother and a highly aggressive voice message from Valerie. I calmly deleted the entire call log, without listening to a single second of it. The trap was now completely set and perfectly primed. Preston had arrogantly gathered all of my toxic family members into one single confined location out on the open water. He had effectively trapped himself and everyone who worshipped him on a rented boat. All Julian and I had to do now was wait for the morning of August 15th to arrive and watch the entire fake empire of Preston violently crash and burn. The morning of August 15th finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, humid heat that settled heavily over the prestigious city harbor. The massive white yachts bobbed gently in the dark blue water, their polished chrome railings gleaming under the bright morning sun. Standing at the very edge of the main private dock was my mother Brenda, holding court among our extended family like a reigning monarch. She was wearing an overly elaborate floral dress that was completely inappropriate for a morning boat ride, but she did not care. She was absolutely thriving in the center of attention. She loudly directed Aunt Denise and Cousin Leroy toward a shaded seating area on the wooden pier, pointing out the massive 3-story mega yacht anchored just a few yards away. The boat was absurdly large, featuring a rooftop jacuzzi and a sleek modern design that screamed excessive wealth. My mother was talking so loudly that the harbor staff were beginning to shoot her irritated glances, but she was entirely too absorbed in her own bragging to notice. She went on and on about how Preston had flown them all out first class, and how Valerie was about to marry into one of the most powerful financial dynasties on the entire East Coast. She made sure to emphasize how lucky they all were to be there, completely ignoring the fact that they were only invited as pawns to hurt me. Inside the private bridal suite of the harbor clubhouse, Valerie was staring at her own reflection in a massive gilded mirror. She was wearing a custom-designed, heavily beaded white gown that supposedly cost $50,000. The dress was suffocatingly tight and covered in heavy crystals that caught the light with every single movement. She looked less like a woman attending a daytime engagement party and much more like someone trying desperately to prove she belonged on a red carpet. She had hired an entire team of professional makeup artists and hairstylists who were frantically hovering around her, spraying expensive perfume and pinning up her blonde hair. She did not spare a single thought for me or the fact that it was supposed to be my wedding day. In her mind, she had won the ultimate victory. She had successfully stolen my family, my date, and what she believed was my dignity. Valerie took a sip from a crystal glass of champagne and smiled a sharp, predatory smile at her reflection. She was completely oblivious to the massive storm that was rapidly brewing just outside the heavy wooden doors of her bridal suite. Out on the wooden docks, the atmosphere was beginning to shift from celebratory to slightly confused. The luxury yacht was fully staffed with uniformed waiters standing at attention near the boarding ramp, holding silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. However, the boarding ramp remained firmly raised and secured. The captain, a stern-looking man in a crisp white uniform, stood at the edge of the deck looking down at the gathered crowd of my relatives with a deeply unimpressed expression. Preston was standing inside the small, air-conditioned office of the harbor master, sweating profusely despite the cool air blowing directly onto his face. He was wearing his pristine white linen suit, but the confident, arrogant swagger he usually carried had completely vanished. Standing across the counter from him was the head harbor master, a no-nonsense woman holding a small black credit card terminal. "I am sorry, sir," she said in a flat, bored tone, "but this card has been declined as well. That is the third card we have tried. The final port taxes and the mandatory boarding fees must be paid in full before the captain will authorize the release of the boarding ramp." Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass window of the office. He could see my mother pointing at the yacht and my Uncle David checking his gold watch. The party was supposed to start boarding 10 minutes ago. There must be some sort of ridiculous bank glitch, Preston stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He aggressively snatched the heavy metal black card from the hand of the harbor master. "Do you have any idea how much money is in this account? I am a senior executive at a major hedge fund. Your cheap little machine is clearly malfunctioning. Try running it again." The harbor master let out a long, exhausted sigh and took the card back. She swiped it slowly through the machine. The small screen instantly flashed the exact same red error message. Declined. Insufficient funds. Please contact your financial institution. She turned the screen around so Preston could see the glaring red letters for himself. It is not our machine, Mr. Preston, she said firmly. Your financial institution is actively blocking the transaction. Perhaps there is a security hold on your account due to the unusually large amount. I suggest you call your bank immediately. We have a strict schedule to maintain today, and there are other vessels waiting for dock clearance. A cold bead of sweat slowly rolled down the side of the face of Preston. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He opened his private banking application expecting to see his massive multi-million-dollar balance. Instead, the screen loaded to show a terrifying string of zeros, followed by a stark notification banner stating that his accounts had been temporarily frozen pending an internal review. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. The reality of his reckless financial gambling was finally catching up to him in real time. He had spent the last 2 years illegally shifting funds between offshore accounts and using client money to cover his massive, risky short-selling bets. He thought he could easily transfer some hidden funds this morning to cover the yacht fees before anyone noticed. He was entirely wrong. He quickly locked his phone and shoved it back into his pocket, forcing a fake, strained smile onto his face as he looked back at the harbor master. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I have a very important engagement party waiting out there. My fiancé is inside the clubhouse. Let them board the yacht and start serving the drinks. I will step into my private car and call my personal wealth manager right now to sort out this silly little computer error. I will have the money wired to you in 10 minutes. The harbor master simply crossed her arms and shook her head. "Harbor policy is strictly payment up front," she replied coldly. "No one steps foot on that vessel until the balance is cleared. You have exactly 20 minutes to resolve this bank glitch before the captain officially cancels your charter." Preston stumbled backward out of the office, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him. The bright sunlight hit his face like a physical blow. He looked out at the crowded dock where my mother was now waving frantically at him, her face completely flushed with excitement. He forced his trembling hand to wave back, projecting the false image of a wealthy man fully in control of his destiny. But deep inside his chest, his heart was hammering wildly against his ribs. The first massive crack had just fractured the foundation of his fake empire, and the entire structure was about to come crashing down directly onto the heads of everyone who had blindly worshipped him. While Preston was desperately sweating on the crowded public docks miles away on the exclusive northern edge of the city, a completely different reality was unfolding. The backyard my family had so viciously mocked was not a small patch of crabgrass behind a modest suburban home. It was a sprawling private estate situated on 300 acres of pristine protected woodlands. The property was valued at over $150 million, and it was completely hidden from the prying eyes of the general public. Towering iron gates stood at the end of a long, winding, tree-lined driveway. These massive gates were heavily guarded by an elite private security team dressed in sharp black suits with discreet earpieces. They meticulously checked the credentials of every single arriving guest, cross-referencing their names on encrypted digital tablets before allowing anyone to pass through. A steady, silent stream of black Maybachs and sleek armored vehicles slowly pulled through the open gates, making their way up to the main house. The guests stepping out of these luxury cars were not flashy social climbers or loud relatives desperate for a free glass of champagne. They were some of the most influential minds in the entire global tech industry. There were billionaire founders of artificial intelligence companies, venture capitalists who controlled massive international portfolios, and quiet philanthropists who funded entire university wings. They mingled softly on the manicured, sweeping lawns, holding crystal glasses of sparkling water and rare vintage wine. There was absolutely no shouting, and no desperate need to prove their worth. True wealth whispers, while fake wealth screams. The air here was filled with the gentle sounds of a live string quartet playing softly under the shade of massive ancient oak trees. The floral arrangements were imported rare orchids perfectly matching the natural beauty of the surrounding forest. Deep inside the main residence, I was standing in front of floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the spectacular ceremony space down below. The master suite alone was larger than the entire childhood home I had grown up in. The walls were adorned with genuine museum-quality artwork, and the floors were made of imported warm mahogany that glowed under the soft lighting. My makeup artist and hairstylist were calm and gentle, speaking in soothing tones as they applied the final touches to my bridal look. I was not wearing a heavy, suffocating gown covered in cheap, flashy crystals like Valerie. My dress was a masterpiece of understated, elegant design made of pure, flowing silk that draped perfectly across my figure. It was simple, breathless, and incredibly comfortable. And resting securely on my left hand, the vintage diamond of my grandmother caught the soft, natural sunlight, anchoring me to the only piece of my past worth keeping. There were no chaotic screaming matches and no frantic relatives demanding my attention. There was only profound, absolute peace. Julian walked into the master suite, his footsteps completely silent on the thick plush rugs. He was no longer dressed in his simple black cotton shirts and casual denim. He wore a breathtaking custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with absolute perfection. He looked exactly like the man he truly was, a visionary leader who commanded immense respect without ever having to raise his voice or demand attention. He walked up behind me and gently wrapped his strong arms around my waist, resting his chin softly on my shoulder. We stood there together looking at our reflection in the massive glass windows. There was no anxiety in his dark eyes, only deep, unwavering love and a quiet, fierce protectiveness. He had spent the last 2 years building an empire from the ground up, and today he was finally ready to share the entire truth of his success with the world. I leaned back into his warm embrace and asked him if everything was ready down below on the lawns. Julian smiled his slow, confident smile and kissed the side of my head. He told me the mayor of the city had just arrived to officiate the ceremony, and the final security sweep of the vast perimeter was completely clear. He also mentioned casually that his chief financial officer had just sent him a very interesting text message regarding the morning market activities. Julian knew exactly what was happening to the fraudulent hedge fund of Preston at that very exact moment. He had set the financial trap months ago, carefully auditing the toxic short positions of Preston and strategically maneuvering his own massive tech assets to expose the vulnerable financial lies of the firm. The massive tech initial public offering that Julian launched this morning was the exact catalyst that shattered the fragile portfolio of Preston into a million irreparable pieces. The absolute poetry of the situation was almost entirely overwhelming to comprehend. My family had blindly thrown away a genuine invitation to sit among true global leaders, just so they could stand on a rented wooden dock with a man who was actively being hunted by federal investigators. They had chosen the loud, shiny illusion over the quiet, solid truth, simply because they were blinded by their own toxic prejudice and endless greed. They thought they were punishing me by leaving me completely alone on my wedding day. But in reality, they had completely isolated themselves on a sinking ship while I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of true security and genuine love. Julian offered me his arm and softly told me it was time to go down to the ceremony. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my entire soul. The girl who used to desperately beg for the crumbs of affection from a family who despised her was completely gone. In her place stood a powerful, independent woman who was about to marry her absolute equal. I linked my arm securely through his, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. As we walked out of the master suite and began to descend the grand sweeping staircase toward the sunlit lawns, I knew I was leaving the broken shadows of my toxic family behind forever. I was stepping out into the bright, secure future of a life I had entirely built on my own terms, and I was ready to finally say my vows. The bright, peaceful morning at the private estate felt like an entirely different universe compared to the stifling, humid heat radiating off the concrete at the city harbor. Back on the public docks, the illusion of extreme luxury was rapidly melting away under the harsh August sun. My mother Brenda was frantically fanning herself with a glossy yacht brochure, her heavy floral dress sticking uncomfortably to her skin. She had spent the entire morning loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about her wealthy future son-in-law, but now her voice was growing strained and impatient. The rest of the extended family was beginning to murmur with growing irritation. They had been standing on the hot wooden pier for nearly 40 minutes, and the heavy boarding ramp of the massive white mega yacht remained firmly raised. The yacht staff in their crisp white uniforms simply stood at the rails looking down at my sweating relatives with total indifference. Valerie finally stormed out of the air-conditioned bridal suite of the clubhouse, dragging her heavy $50,000 crystal-covered gown across the dirty concrete. Her professional makeup was already beginning to shine with sweat, and her carefully pinned blonde hair was frizzing in the dense ocean humidity. The heavy dress was never meant to be worn outside on a hot dock. It was designed for air-conditioned luxury ballrooms and cool ocean breezes. She aggressively pushed her way through our tired relatives and marched directly toward Preston, who was pacing erratically near the side of the harbor master office. "What is taking so long, Preston?" she demanded, her voice taking on that shrill, spoiled tone she always used when she was denied immediate gratification. "My dress is suffocating me, and Uncle David is complaining about his blood pressure. Tell the captain to lower the ramp right now so we can get into the air conditioning and start opening the expensive champagne." Preston did not answer her. He could not answer her. He was staring blankly out at the dark blue water, his usually immaculate white linen suit now heavily wrinkled and damp with nervous perspiration. He had spent the last 15 minutes desperately dialing his personal wealth manager, his business partners, and his offshore accounts. Every single call had gone straight to a disconnected automated voicemail. The massive financial firewall he had built to protect his fraudulent activities had completely vanished, leaving him entirely exposed. He knew that when the people who handled your dirty money stopped answering their phones, it meant they were already talking to the federal authorities. Suddenly, the sleek smartphone in his trembling hand began to vibrate. It was not a normal phone call. It was a continuous, violent buzzing that sounded like a swarm of angry bees trapped inside the metal casing. The screen lit up blindingly bright, displaying a rapid-fire barrage of push notifications from every major global financial news outlet. Preston slowly lifted the phone, staring at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake about to strike his face. He opened the first notification from the Wall Street Journal, and his entire world instantly imploded. The bold black headline read, "Breaking News. Major Wall Street hedge fund collapses overnight following historic short squeeze." His breathing turned into shallow, rapid gasps as his eyes scanned the brutal financial article. The text detailed exactly how his highly leveraged firm had aggressively bet heavily against a rising tech startup. They had illegally used client funds to try and force the tech company into bankruptcy. But that same tech startup had just gone public this morning, launching the most successful initial public offering of the entire decade. The soaring stock price of the tech firm had triggered a massive catastrophic margin call. The hedge fund of Preston was not just broke, it was billions of dollars in debt. The article ended with a terrifying final sentence stating that federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI were currently raiding the corporate headquarters in New York City, seizing computers and freezing all associated bank accounts. Julian had not just beaten him. Julian had entirely financially annihilated him from the shadows without ever raising a single finger in public. Valerie grabbed the arm of Preston, her sharp acrylic nails digging deeply into the sleeve of his expensive white linen suit. Are you even listening to me? She shrieked, physically shaking his arm. Go tell the captain to let us on the boat right now. I am the bride and this is my special day. You promised me a luxury party and everyone is staring at us. Preston looked at Valerie, and for the very first time he did not see a beautiful trophy wife who elevated his social status. He saw a demanding, spoiled liability who was standing directly between him and his desperate need to flee the country. He looked at my mother, who was marching toward them with an angry scowl on her face, ready to demand answers about the delay. He looked at the dozens of relatives he had arrogantly flown out first class, realizing he had absolutely no way to pay for their return tickets or their luxury hotel suites. He was looking at a massive crowd of angry people who were about to realize he was nothing but a broke criminal. The fake billionaire facade completely shattered. Pure primal survival instinct took over his mind. I need to take this call, he mumbled, his voice barely a hollow whisper. His eyes darted wildly around the harbor, searching for the quickest exit route away from the docks and the incoming police sirens he was absolutely certain were already on their way. Who is calling you? Valerie demanded, trying to snatch the phone from his trembling hand. You can take a phone call on the boat. Preston, just fix this right now. It is my bank manager, Preston lied, his voice cracking terribly. He violently yanked his arm out of her tight grip, almost causing Valerie to trip over the heavy hem of her crystal gown. There is a massive security protocol issue with the wire transfer. The harbor reception is terrible here. I just need to walk up to my car, where it is quiet, so I can verify my personal credentials. I will be right back, Valerie. I promise. Just wait right here. He did not wait for her to argue. Preston turned his back on his furious fiancée and started walking briskly toward the massive asphalt parking lot. His brisk walk quickly turned into a panicked, desperate jog. He pushed past a group of tourists, almost knocking over a small child in his frantic rush to reach his luxury SUV. He did not care about the yacht. He did not care about the engagement party, and he certainly did not care about Valerie anymore. His only thought was getting to the nearest international airport before his passport was permanently flagged by federal authorities. Valerie stood completely frozen on the wooden docks, staring at the retreating back of the man she had proudly claimed was 10 times better than Julian. Confusion and a deep, sickening sense of panic began to set into her chest. She turned back to our mother, who had finally reached the edge of the pier. Where is he going? Brenda asked sharply, wiping sweat from her forehead. Did he get the ramp lowered? Valerie opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form a single word, a strange collective sound rippled through the gathered crowd of our relatives. It started as a series of soft electronic chimes and urgent buzzing sounds. Uncle David pulled his phone out of his pocket. Cousin Leroy looked down at his smartwatch. Aunt Denise opened a breaking news notification that had just popped up on her screen. The financial news had officially broken the mainstream media barrier, and it was now spreading like absolute wildfire across social media platforms. One by one, the toxic family members who had gleefully abandoned me to worship the fake wealth of Preston began reading the devastating headlines for themselves. The collective silence that fell over the hot wooden pier was heavier and infinitely more suffocating than the dense August humidity. Miles away from that suffocating hot pier, the gentle afternoon breeze was rustling through the ancient oak trees of the private estate. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into a breathtaking classical piece, signaling the beginning of my walk down the aisle. I stood at the edge of the sprawling, manicured lawn, looking out at the massive sea of elegantly dressed guests. There were no empty folding chairs sitting in the dirt like Preston had cruelly predicted. Instead, the rows of beautifully carved wooden seating were completely filled with hundreds of the most influential and successful people in the entire country. I took my first deliberate step onto the thick white petal-strewn runner, feeling a profound sense of absolute lightness. I was walking down this long aisle completely alone, but I did not feel abandoned for a single second. I felt entirely liberated. Every single step I took away from my toxic past was a deliberate step toward a bright future built on absolute truth and unwavering mutual respect. The warm August sunlight filtered through the lush green canopy above, casting a soft golden glow over the entire spectacular ceremony space. As I slowly made my way down the long, elegant aisle, I could hear the soft, reverent murmurs of the elite guests. They were not whispering malicious gossip or engaging in the petty family drama that I was so used to hearing. They were excitedly discussing the monumental financial earthquake that had just occurred that very morning in the global markets. A prominent venture capitalist sitting in the second row leaned over to his elegant wife and quietly murmured about the spectacular $24 billion valuation. Another seasoned tech founder sitting nearby nodded in absolute awe, whispering about the sheer brilliant ruthlessness of the morning initial public offering. They were talking about Julian. They were talking about the quiet, unassuming man who my parents had relentlessly mocked for being a freelance computer repair guy. Julian had officially taken his revolutionary artificial intelligence company public right as the opening bell rang on Wall Street just a few hours ago. The stock had skyrocketed beyond all projected expectations, cementing his permanent status as one of the youngest and most powerful billionaires in the entire global tech industry. But the awestruck whispers rippling through the wealthy crowd did not stop at his massive, newly acquired wealth. The brilliant, highly tactical financial strategy of Julian was the true topic of absolute fascination among these elite guests. My incredibly smart future husband had known for many months that the corrupt hedge fund managed by Preston was aggressively and illegally shorting the stock of his allied tech partners. Preston had been trying to artificially drive their promising companies into the ground for his own greedy profit. Julian had waited so patiently in the shadows, meticulously gathering complex financial data and quietly preparing his massive, undeniable counterstrike. The historic $24 billion public offering today was not just a major corporate business milestone. It was a highly calculated, lethal financial trap designed specifically to trigger the exact catastrophic margin call that completely obliterated the fraudulent firm of Preston. Julian had quietly dismantled a toxic Wall Street empire without ever raising his voice or making a single public threat. He had protected our future, our investments, and completely neutralized the arrogant man who had desperately tried to humiliate us both. And Julian had executed this flawless victory all before lunchtime on our actual wedding day. I finally reached the end of the long, pristine white runner and stepped up to the stunning floral archway. The air smelled like rare, expensive orchids and fresh pine. Julian stepped forward and gently took both of my trembling hands in his own. His touch was incredibly warm and deeply grounding, anchoring me completely to the present moment. Standing directly in front of us, acting as the official legal officiant for our ceremony, was the actual mayor of the city himself. He was a highly distinguished man who had cleared his entire busy political schedule just to stand there for Julian today. The mayor smiled warmly at us, his powerful presence serving as a silent, undeniable testament to the immense respect and influence Julian commanded in this major city. The mayor began to speak, his deep, resonant voice projecting clearly across the completely silent and highly attentive crowd. He spoke beautifully and eloquently about true partnership, about the vital importance of deep trust, and about the rare kind of formidable love that builds modern empires and successfully weathers the most severe storms. Julian looked down at me, his dark eyes shining with an intense, overwhelming emotion that took my breath away. He did not care about the billionaires watching us or the massive fortune he had just secured. He only cared about the woman standing right in front of him. He spoke his vows softly, but with absolute, unshakable conviction, so that only I and the mayor could truly hear the depth of his promise. Julian promised to fiercely protect my peace, to always value my brilliant, independent mind, and to proudly stand as my equal in every single battle we might ever face in this lifetime. He thanked me for seeing the true value in him when everyone else only saw a quiet man in a plain black shirt. As I spoke my vows in return, I looked down at the massive vintage diamond of my grandmother shining brilliantly on my left finger. The diamond caught the bright sunlight, reflecting the absolute pure joy in my heart. I promised to love him unconditionally, to always audit his heart with tender care, and to boldly build a lasting legacy together that would permanently outshine the dark, heavy shadows of my abusive past. I looked into the eyes of the $24 billion chief executive officer who had just avenged my honor, and I knew with absolute certainty that we were completely invincible. We exchanged our heavy platinum rings, sealing our silent, unbreakable pact. The mayor happily pronounced us husband and wife, and as Julian leaned in to kiss me, the entire estate erupted into deafening, joyful applause. While my new husband and I were basking in the joyful applause of our wedding guests, the suffocating tension back at the city harbor had reached an absolute boiling point. Uncle David and Cousin Leroy were staring at their glowing phone screens in stunned horror. The brutal financial headlines exposing the complete collapse of the hedge fund of Preston were spreading rapidly through the crowd of my relatives. My mother, Brenda, snatched the phone from the hand of Uncle David, her eyes scanning the bold black text. She shook her head violently, completely refusing to accept the reality that the wealthy white savior she had worshipped was actually a desperate criminal. Valerie was standing on the wooden pier, trembling with a mixture of intense humiliation and furious denial. She saw the shocked expressions on the faces of her family members, but her fragile ego simply could not handle the public destruction of her perfect narrative. She turned aggressively toward the head harbor master and demanded that they be allowed to board the yacht immediately. She shrieked that she had a 5-tier custom engagement cake sitting on the main deck melting in the hot sun, and she was not going to let a stupid bank glitch ruin her photos. The harbor master, thoroughly exhausted by the screaming bride and wanting to keep the angry crowd contained on the vessel rather than blocking the public pier, let out a heavy sigh. She agreed to lower the boarding ramp just enough to let them onto the stationary main deck to cut the cake, but she firmly stated that the yacht was absolutely not leaving the dock until the federal authorities arrived to clear the unpaid invoices. Valerie immediately plastered a terrifyingly fake smile onto her face and ordered our confused relatives to walk up the ramp. My mother blindly followed, still clutching the phone and desperately whispering that Preston would come back and fix everything. They gathered awkwardly around a massive table on the luxurious aft deck, where a towering white fondant cake was slowly wilting in the brutal August heat. The uniformed yacht staff stood far back near the sliding glass doors, watching the pathetic scene unfold with complete disdain. Valerie picked up a silver cake knife, her hands shaking violently. She looked around the deck, realizing that the man she was supposed to be celebrating with was nowhere to be found. Preston had completely abandoned her, but she was so deeply obsessed with her fake image that she raised the silver knife anyway, preparing to cut the cake for the cameras of her silent, terrified relatives. Meanwhile, up in the massive asphalt parking lot, Preston was frantically pulling the door handle of his luxury SUV. He was sweating through his expensive linen suit, his heart pounding in his ears like a bass drum. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed his finger against the push-to-start button. The engine roared to life. He threw the vehicle into reverse, completely desperate to escape the harbor before the Financial Crimes Division realized his exact location. But just as he pressed his foot down on the gas pedal, a massive black tactical vehicle suddenly swerved directly into his path, blocking his exit completely. The screeching of heavy tires echoed across the concrete lot. Within seconds, 3 more unmarked black federal vehicles surrounded his SUV, trapping him instantly. The doors of the tactical vehicles flew open and heavily armed agents wearing dark FBI windbreakers poured out into the parking lot. Preston froze in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel, as if it could somehow protect him. An agent forcefully yanked the driver's side door open and ordered Preston to step out of the vehicle with his hands entirely visible. The arrogant Wall Street broker who had thrown a $5,000 check in my face just a few days ago was now completely sobbing like a terrified child. They aggressively pulled him out of the luxury SUV, pushed him against the side of the car, and slammed heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists. They read him his Miranda rights, loudly informing him that he was under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, illegal insider trading, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. Down on the main deck of the yacht, Valerie forced a bright, artificial smile and pressed the silver knife into the top tier of the wilting engagement cake. She demanded that cousin Leroy take a picture, but before the camera could flash, the heavy sound of marching boots echoed loudly down the wooden pier. Valerie paused, the knife still buried in the cake. My mother gasped and grabbed the railing. Marching down the dock toward the yacht were 6 federal agents from the FBI, heavily flanked by 3 armed officers from the United States Coast Guard. And walking right in the center of the imposing formation, looking completely pathetic and defeated, was Preston. His custom white linen suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat, and his hands were securely cuffed behind his back. Valerie dropped the silver cake knife. It hit the deck with a sharp clatter. "Preston!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "What are you doing to him? Let him go. He is a prominent hedge fund executive." The lead FBI agent stopped at the bottom of the boarding ramp and looked up at the hysterical bride. "Ma," he announced, his voice booming over the quiet harbor. "Your fiancé is currently under federal arrest for defrauding investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars. All of his assets are frozen, including the funds he attempted to use to secure this vessel." The representative from the luxury yacht charter company immediately stepped forward, standing right next to the federal agents. He looked up at Valerie and my mother with a cold, uncompromising glare. "Since the deposit for this charter was made with fraudulent stolen funds and the final balance has been declined, the contract is entirely null and void," he declared loudly. "You are all trespassing on private corporate property. You have exactly 2 minutes to exit this vessel before I have the Coast Guard forcibly remove you for trespassing and theft of services." The reality of the situation finally crashed down onto the deck like a massive physical weight. The fake empire had not just cracked, it had been utterly annihilated in front of every single person who had worshipped it. The terrified relatives, who had eagerly abandoned my wedding to drink free champagne, now realized they were directly involved in a federal crime scene. Uncle David practically shoved past Valerie, grabbing his wife by the arm and rushing down the boarding ramp. The rest of the extended family immediately followed, fleeing the luxury yacht like rats escaping a rapidly sinking ship. They bumped into each other, tripping over the expensive deck chairs, completely desperate to distance themselves from Preston and Valerie, before the FBI decided to question them too. My mother stood paralyzed, clutching the wooden railing, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. Valerie collapsed onto the deck right next to her ruined, melting engagement cake, sobbing hysterically as she watched the federal agents forcefully escort her handcuffed, wealthy fiancé into the back of a black tactical vehicle. The yacht staff quickly moved in, shouting orders for my mother and Valerie to get off the boat immediately. The glamorous yacht party they had so maliciously planned to destroy my wedding day had officially ended in absolute spectacular ruin. The golden child was sitting in a puddle of melted frosting and bitter tears, while the fake billionaire was being hauled away to federal prison. The harsh reality of their spectacular downfall set in the moment the heavy wooden boarding ramp hit the concrete dock with a loud final thud. The yacht crew had absolutely no sympathy for the hysterical bride sitting on their pristine deck. 2 burly security guards in crisp white uniforms marched right up to Valerie and ordered her to stand up. When she refused to move and just kept sobbing into her hands, they grabbed her by the arms and physically hoisted her to her feet. She was completely covered in sticky white fondant, and her $50,000 designer gown was ruined beyond repair. They ushered her down the ramp like a common trespasser. My mother, Brenda, and my father, Jerome, followed closely behind her, their faces pale and completely drained of all that arrogant pride they had paraded around with all morning. They stumbled off the luxury mega yacht and joined the rest of our extended family, who were huddled together on the blistering hot concrete of the public pier. The August sun was beating down on them mercilessly. There was no shade, no ocean breeze, and certainly no expensive champagne to cool them down. Instead, they were surrounded by their heavy designer luggage, looking like a group of displaced refugees in formal wear. The absolute silence of shock that had gripped the family when Preston was arrested was rapidly fading, replaced by a rising tide of fierce anger and bitter resentment. Uncle David was the first one to completely snap. He threw his expensive suit jacket onto the dirty ground and marched right up to my father. His face was purple with rage. He demanded to know what was going on and who was going to pay for the massive inconvenience. Preston had promised them all luxury suites at the Four Seasons and first-class flights home. But with his assets completely frozen by the federal government, the horrifying realization began to ripple through the crowd. The hotel reservations were completely void. The return flights were likely purchased with fraudulent credit cards that were now entirely canceled. The extended family was completely stranded in the middle of a hot, crowded city harbor with absolutely nowhere to go and no way to get home. Aunt Denise started shrieking at my mother. She aggressively pointed her finger right in the face of Brenda. She yelled that they had abandoned their own niece on her wedding day just to come support a fake billionaire who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. The toxic loyalty that Preston had successfully purchased with stolen money evaporated into thin air the exact second the money disappeared. They were viciously turning on each other like wild animals trapped in a small cage. Cousin Leroy was furiously tapping on his phone, trying to book a cheap motel room while cursing the name of Valerie loudly enough for the entire harbor to hear. Valerie was sitting on a hard wooden bench nearby, completely ignoring the chaotic screaming match happening right in front of her. She was staring blankly at the dark blue water, her ruined dress soaking up the dirty puddles on the concrete. She kept muttering to herself that it was all a big mistake and that Preston would call his powerful lawyers to fix everything. She was entirely delusional, trapped in the shattered remains of her golden child fantasy. My mother desperately tried to regain some tiny shred of control over the disastrous situation. She raised her hands and loudly ordered everyone to stop shouting. She told them she would handle it. She promised she would fix everything and find them a place to stay. She dug her trembling hand into her expensive floral purse and pulled out her smartphone. She loudly announced to the angry crowd of relatives that she was going to call me. She actually told them she was going to call Tessa and demand that Julian let them all come over to his little backyard barbecue so they could at least have some free food and a place to sit down in the shade. She still truly believed that my wedding was a pathetic, cheap gathering and that I would be desperately grateful if my wealthy family finally decided to show up. She unlocked her phone screen, fully intending to dial my number and demand my immediate submission. But before her thumb could even press the call icon, her screen suddenly flashed bright white. A loud, aggressive alarm tone blared from her phone, cutting through the angry shouting of the extended family. It was a high-priority push notification from ABC News overriding all her other applications. The bold red banner across the top of her screen read, "Breaking news live coverage of the tech wedding of the decade." My mother frowned in deep confusion. She did not care about tech news, but her thumb accidentally tapped the alert banner in her frantic state. The screen instantly switched to a live high-definition video broadcast. The audio feed of the news anchor echoed loudly from the small phone speaker. The anchor was excitedly talking about the monumental $24 billion initial public offering that had shocked Wall Street that morning. But the video footage was not showing a boring corporate boardroom or a busy stock exchange floor. The video was showing breathtaking aerial footage from a news helicopter hovering high above a sprawling $150 million private estate in the lush northern hills of the city. The camera zoomed in on a massive, sweeping green lawn completely filled with hundreds of elegant guests sitting in beautifully carved wooden chairs. There were dozens of black Maybachs parked perfectly in the circular driveway and armed security guards patrolling the massive iron gates. Uncle David and Aunt Denise stopped yelling and stepped closer to look at the bright screen. The entire family gathered around the small device, completely mesmerized by the sheer unimaginable scale of the luxury event playing out on the live broadcast. The news anchor continued speaking, his voice filled with genuine awe. He announced that the brilliant, elusive tech billionaire, who had just legally crushed a corrupt hedge fund earlier that morning, was currently exchanging vows in a highly private ceremony. Then the news cameras switched from the wide helicopter shot to a crystal-clear ground-level feed provided by the official press pool at the estate. The camera focused tightly on the beautiful floral archway at the end of the long white aisle. My mother gasped so sharply, it sounded like she was physically choking. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. The phone nearly slipped from her sweaty hands. Standing there under the spectacular arch of rare orchids, looking more powerful and completely radiant than ever before, was me. The camera captured the stunning, flawless drape of my custom silk gown and the blinding, brilliant flash of my grandmother's vintage diamond catching the sun on my left hand. Standing right next to me, holding my hands with deep, unconditional love, was Julian wearing his custom midnight blue tuxedo. He looked like absolute royalty. And standing right in front of us, officially uniting us in marriage, was the highly distinguished mayor of our city. The news anchor cheerfully narrated the beautiful scene, identifying the breathtaking bride as an independent corporate auditor who had bravely helped her new billionaire husband expose the massive Wall Street fraud earlier that very day. The relatives, standing on the hot, dirty docks, stared at the small, glowing screen in absolute total silence. The horrific, crushing truth finally hit them with the destructive force of a massive freight train. The backyard barbecue they had so viciously mocked was actually the most exclusive billionaire wedding of the entire decade. The freelance computer repair guy they had laughed at was actually the $24 billion tech titan who had completely destroyed the arrogant white broker they had so foolishly worshipped. They had blindly thrown away a genuine invitation to absolute paradise just so they could be stranded on a hot concrete pier with a criminal. The ultimate humiliation was complete, and the entire world was watching it happen live on national television. The small glowing screen in the trembling hands of my mother Brenda became the absolute center of the universe for our stranded family. They crowded together on the blistering concrete, their sweaty faces illuminated by the bright digital display. The live broadcast continued to roll, capturing the breathtaking moment Julian and I shared our first kiss as a married couple. The crowd of billionaires and elite politicians erupted into a standing ovation that echoed loudly, even through the tiny speaker of the smartphone. Brenda could not look away. She was completely mesmerized and entirely horrified by the opulent reality playing out right in front of her eyes. The camera zoomed in on my face, and for the first time my family saw the true extent of my bridal attire. I was not just wearing a simple silk gown. Draped elegantly across my collarbones was a breathtaking custom necklace made of flawless cascading diamonds that caught the light like a constellation of stars. Julian had gifted it to me that very morning. It made the imaginary jewelry Valerie had demanded look like cheap plastic toys. The live feed shifted slightly as a prominent national news anchor, dressed in a sharp suit, approached Julian and me near the base of the floral archway. It was a highly orchestrated media moment that Julian had personally arranged. He wanted the entire world to know exactly who was standing beside him on the most important day of his professional and personal life. The reporter held out a microphone, his face glowing with eager anticipation. "Julian, sir," the reporter began, his voice breathless with excitement. "Congratulations on your historic marriage and on the absolute dominance of your initial public offering this morning. The financial world is in complete shock. Wall Street is calling it the most brilliant financial counterstrike of the decade. How does it feel to achieve a $24 billion valuation while simultaneously neutralizing a massive hostile takeover attempt?" Julian smiled his calm, confident smile. He did not look into the camera. Instead, he looked directly down at me, his eyes filled with profound admiration. He gently squeezed my hand and then leaned toward the microphone. "I cannot take the credit for the victory on Wall Street today," Julian said, his deep voice resonating with absolute authority. "The true architect of this morning is standing right here holding my hand. My beautiful wife Tessa is a fiercely brilliant independent corporate auditor. Months ago, we realized that a highly corrupt hedge fund was attempting to illegally short our stock and force a hostile takeover to destroy everything my team had built. On the hot wooden dock, my mother stopped breathing. Valerie slowly looked up from the puddle of melted cake, her tear-streaked face twisting in pure agony. They knew exactly what Julian was about to say. Julian continued speaking clearly and deliberately so that no one could possibly misunderstand him. The manager of that hedge fund was a man named Preston. He was a reckless broker who used stolen client money and illegal offshore accounts to fund his fake lifestyle. He thought he could easily intimidate us and bully our tech partners into submission. But he made one massive fatal mistake. He underestimated the unmatched intelligence of my wife. Tessa single-handedly audited his fraudulent shadow accounts. She followed his dirty money, and she built the undeniable financial trap that we triggered this morning with our public offering. She did not just save my entire company. She protected the investments of thousands of innocent people. The reporter looked absolutely stunned by the massive, exclusive scoop he was getting on live television. He pressed his earpiece, listening to his producers in the studio. "Sir," the reporter said, his voice rising in pitch, "we are actually receiving breaking confirmation right now that federal agents have just arrested Preston at the city harbor for massive wire fraud and insider trading. Your trap worked perfectly." I looked directly into the news camera, giving a calm, unwavering smile. I knew that somewhere in the city my toxic family was watching this exact broadcast. I spoke into the microphone, my voice completely steady and serene. "The truth always comes to the light," I said softly. "Some people build their entire lives on loud illusions and fake wealth, trying to tear down anyone who threatens their fragile ego. But true wealth is built on integrity, hard work, and unconditional loyalty. Julian and I are incredibly blessed to be surrounded by people who genuinely love us today. We left all the toxic noise behind us, and we could not be happier." The reporter thanked us profusely as the camera panned back up to the sky, showing the sprawling $150 million estate one last time before cutting back to the news studio. The screen on the phone of my mother faded to black. The live broadcast was over, but the devastating impact of my words hung heavily in the thick, humid air of the harbor. There was absolute silence among the stranded relatives. The brutal reality of their terrible choices had finally crushed them completely. Valerie let out a long, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She clutched her ruined designer dress, pulling at her blonde hair. Her perfect, wealthy white savior was actually a desperate fraud who was now facing decades in federal prison. The private yacht party was a complete lie. Her massive diamond engagement ring was likely purchased with stolen funds and would soon be seized by the federal government. She had absolutely nothing left. She was completely bankrupt, socially, financially, and emotionally. My mother Brenda dropped her smartphone onto the concrete dock. The glass screen shattered into a dozen jagged pieces, mirroring her completely broken reality. She had spent her entire life worshiping the shallow illusion of money and status. She had actively encouraged my family to emotionally abuse and abandon me just to stay in the good graces of a criminal. And in doing so, she had proudly thrown away her only real connection to actual, unimaginable wealth. She had traded a genuine, loving billionaire son-in-law for a broke federal inmate. Uncle David stared at Brenda with absolute disgust. "You did this?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You and your spoiled daughter pushed Tessa away. You made us all believe she was just a jealous liar. You made us boycott a billionaire wedding for this humiliated disaster. We are completely stranded here, and it is all your fault, Brenda." The rest of the extended family immediately joined in, shouting angrily at my parents and Valerie. They demanded money for their ruined trips. They demanded apologies, and they completely disowned the golden child right there on the hot, dirty concrete. The family unity that was supposedly so important to my parents evaporated the exact moment the fake money ran out. They were turning on each other, completely consumed by their own greedy regrets. The trap I had set had not just caught Preston, it had captured the entire toxic family dynamic, exposing them all for the shallow, miserable people they truly were. Brenda sank down onto the hot concrete right next to her shattered phone. She finally understood the quiet, confident smirk I had given her at that miserable Sunday dinner. She finally understood why I never shed a single tear when they all threatened to abandon me. I had known the absolute truth the entire time. I held all the power, all the wealth, and all the dignity, while they had absolutely nothing but their own toxic lies. The loud screaming of my relatives echoed across the empty harbor, but nobody was coming to save them. They were completely alone, trapped in the very prison of humiliation they had tried to build for me. The loud screaming of my relatives echoing across the empty harbor was suddenly pierced by a sound so guttural it barely seemed human. Valerie pushed herself up from the sticky puddle of melted fondant, her hands covered in white icing and harbor dirt. She began to scream violently, tearing at the heavy crystal bodice of her ruined $50,000 gown. "No!" she shrieked, her voice completely hoarse and frantic. "It is a lie. It is all a massive lie. Preston is a billionaire. He is going to come back for me." She stumbled blindly across the hot concrete, looking like a deranged ghost in her stained wedding dress. Uncle David just scoffed at her, kicking his expensive leather shoe against the wooden pilings of the dock. "Your fake billionaire is currently getting his fingerprints taken at a federal precinct, Valerie," he spat furiously. "You dragged us all out here for absolutely nothing." My mother, Brenda, remained sitting on the blistering concrete, staring down at the jagged shards of her shattered smartphone. The live broadcast had ended, but the image of my vintage diamond necklace and the sprawling $150 million estate was permanently burned into her greedy mind. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. She had just watched the daughter she had relentlessly abused and discarded become one of the wealthiest women in the entire country. Slowly, the overwhelming shock began to morph into something else entirely. It morphed into a desperate, ravenous hunger. Brenda did not feel a single ounce of genuine guilt or remorse for how she had treated me. She only felt a burning, obsessive need to get her hands on that massive fortune. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the harbor dirt off her heavy floral dress with shaking hands. "Listen to me," she yelled loudly, waving her arms to silence the furious arguing of our extended family. "Stop yelling and listen to me right now. Tessa is my daughter. She is my own flesh and blood." The relatives paused, turning to look at Brenda with absolute disbelief. Aunt Denise crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Your daughter?" she mocked bitterly. "The same daughter you just forced us to abandon so we could stand on a hot dock with a federal criminal." Brenda ignored the brutal insult. Her eyes were wide and frantic with desperate calculation. It was just a simple misunderstanding. Brenda lied, trying to convince herself, just as much as she was trying to convince them. Family fights all the time, but at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. Tessa is a billionaire now. Do you all understand what that actually means? She is marrying the most powerful tech executive in the city. They have enough money to buy us all new houses and new cars without even checking their bank balances. We just need to go to her wedding right now and apologize. We will tell her that Preston tricked us and held us hostage. She will forgive us because she has always been a soft, forgiving girl. She will let us into that estate, and we will never have to worry about money ever again. The sheer mention of unlimited wealth was enough to instantly extinguish the righteous anger of my toxic relatives. Their deep-seated greed easily overpowered their temporary outrage. Suddenly, they all wanted to be the supportive, loving family they had aggressively refused to be just a few hours earlier. But there was a massive, glaring problem. They were completely stranded at the city harbor, and Preston had not actually arranged any luxury black cars to take them anywhere. Cousin Leroy frantically ran out toward the main street, wildly waving his arms to flag down any available transportation. He managed to stop a small fleet of 3 run-down yellow city taxis. The cabs were severely dented, smelling strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap artificial air freshener. It was a massive, humiliating downgrade from the sleek, armored Maybachs they had just watched, pulling into my wedding venue on national television. Brenda aggressively shoved Valerie toward the first dirty taxi. "Get in the car. Valerie, and stop crying," she commanded harshly, pulling her weeping golden child by the arm. "You are going to smile, and you are going to beg your sister for forgiveness if you have to." The family hastily crammed themselves into the back seats of the cramped taxis, hauling their heavy designer luggage onto their laps. The ride from the harbor to the exclusive northern hills was a miserable, suffocating journey. The air conditioning in the taxis barely worked, and the dense August heat was completely trapped inside the small vehicles. Valerie sat in the back of the cab, leaving a sticky trail of melted cake frosting and sweat on the cracked leather seats, while Brenda obsessively rehearsed her fake apology speech under her breath. They were no longer proud socialites attending the elite event of the season. They were a desperate, sweaty mob, completely stripped of their false dignity, racing across the city to beg for scraps from the table they had previously mocked. The contrast was absolutely poetic. Brenda kept looking at the taxi meter, watching the fare climb higher and higher, silently praying that her credit card would not decline when they arrived. As the cheap yellow taxis finally labored up the steep, winding road into the elite private neighborhood, the entire atmosphere outside the windows began to change. The towering ancient trees cast cool, elegant shadows over the pristine road, and the massive iron gates of the private estate finally came into view. Brenda pressed her sweaty face against the smudged taxi window, her eyes wide with unadulterated greed and awe. The sheer massive scale of the property was even more intimidating in person than it was on the television screen. They had finally arrived at the absolute fortress of my new life, completely ready to grovel for a single drop of my newfound immense wealth. The taxis screeched to a halt just outside the imposing stone pillars, and Brenda threw the car door open, ready to march right in and reclaim her rich daughter. She stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway, leaving the foul-smelling yellow taxi behind her. She smoothed down the wrinkled fabric of her sweaty floral dress, attempting to muster the arrogant authority she used to wield so effortlessly back at our old house. Valerie crawled out of the cab right behind her, still completely covered in dried cake frosting, looking absolutely wretched. The rest of the extended family dragged their heavy designer luggage out of the trunks, the cheap plastic wheels loudly scraping against the expensive stone pavement. The massive wrought iron gates stood over 12 feet tall, intricate and imposing, securely locked tight. Standing firmly in front of the heavy steel doors were 4 elite security guards. They were not the relaxed, friendly neighborhood watch type of guards. They wore sharp black tactical suits, discreet earpieces, and utility belts that clearly held heavy weaponry. They stood with their feet firmly planted, their hands clasped calmly in front of them, watching the chaotic arrival of my family with absolute stone-cold indifference. Brenda marched right up to the tallest guard, pointing a manicured finger toward the thick iron bars. "Open these gates right now," she demanded, using her harsh, motherly tone. "I am the mother of the bride. My daughter Tessa is inside, and we have had a terrible morning. We are here to join the wedding reception. So open the gates and have someone come out here to collect all of our luggage immediately." The lead security guard did not even blink. He did not shift his stance or look intimidated in the slightest. He slowly reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a sleek digital tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, pulling up the highly encrypted guest list that Julian had personally finalized. "May I have your full legal name, Ma?" He asked, his voice completely flat and heavily professional. Brenda scoffed loudly, waving her hand as if the highly trained guard were a minor annoyance. "I just told you who I am," she snapped aggressively. "I am Brenda. This is my daughter Valerie, and the rest of our extended family standing right behind me. We do not need to be on some silly list. Tessa is my own blood. Just radio up to the main house and tell her that her mother is waiting outside in this terrible heat." The guard calmly swiped his finger across the glowing screen of his tablet. "I am looking at the complete approved guest list, Ma'am. he replied, his tone remaining perfectly level and uncompromising. There is no Brenda on this list. There is no Valerie. In fact, I have very specific, explicit instructions directly from the groom regarding anyone claiming to be the biological family of the bride today. Brenda froze, her arrogant posture faltering for a brief, terrible second. "What instructions?" she asked, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave as a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. The guard looked up from his tablet, locking his cold, dark eyes directly onto her sweaty, flushed face. "Mr. Julian explicitly stated that the bride has absolutely no family attending today," he said clearly. "He instructed my security team that if any unauthorized individuals attempt to breach this perimeter, claiming to be related to his wife, we are to treat them as hostile trespassers and remove them from the premises immediately." Valerie pushed past my mother, grabbing the thick iron bars of the gate with her sticky, frosting-covered hands. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked violently, shaking the heavy metal gate, but it did not move a single millimeter. "You do not understand what is happening to me. My fiancé was just arrested by the FBI down at the harbor. I have absolutely nothing left in the world. I need to see my sister right now. Tell her I am out here. Tell her I am so sorry for everything." The guards did not react to her hysterical begging. They had dealt with corporate spies and obsessive, dangerous stalkers, so they were completely immune to the fake crying of a spoiled golden child. The lead guard simply took one deliberate step forward, placing his hand dangerously close to his heavy utility belt. "Step away from the gate immediately." "Miss," he warned, his voice dropping into a dangerously low and highly intimidating register. The rest of the family stood paralyzed in the hot driveway, clutching their heavy, useless suitcases. They could clearly hear the breathtaking sounds of the luxury reception drifting over the high stone walls. The beautiful, sweeping notes of a live classical string quartet filled the air, mixing with the joyful, relaxed laughter of the billionaire guests and the gentle clinking of expensive crystal glasses. It sounded like absolute heaven. It sounded like pure safety, immense wealth, and total happiness. And they were completely, permanently locked out of it forever. Uncle David wiped the thick sweat from his forehead, looking through the dark iron bars, with a look of profound, absolute defeat. "We are not getting in, Brenda," he mumbled, his voice entirely hollow. "They do not want us here at all. She does not want us here." "No," Brenda screamed, spinning around to face him with wild, desperate eyes. "I am her mother. I raised her in my house. I gave her everything she has. She owes me. She owes this entire family. She cannot just marry a powerful billionaire and leave us all out here on the street like common garbage." But the harsh, beautiful reality was that I could. And I absolutely did. The imposing iron gates were the ultimate physical manifestation of the emotional boundaries I had finally learned to set. My mother had spent my entire life loudly teaching me that her love was entirely conditional, based only on how much I was willing to blindly sacrifice for Valerie. Now she was standing on the dirty outside of my impenetrable fortress, realizing that the very daughter she had constantly deemed completely worthless was actually holding all the keys to the kingdom. One of the security guards lifted a radio to his mouth, pressing the button on his broad shoulder. "We have a hostile group of unauthorized individuals loitering at the main front gate." He spoke clearly into the microphone. "Send the local police patrol cars to clear the driveway immediately. We have a highly aggressive trespassing situation." Aunt Denise let out a terrified gasp, grabbing her heavy luggage with shaking hands. "They are calling the police," she panicked, her eyes darting around the empty, winding road. "Brenda, we have to go right now. We cannot afford to get arrested today. Preston is already in federal custody. We are all going to end up in a jail cell." The yellow taxi drivers, who had been waiting for their massive, expensive fares, began honking their horns aggressively, demanding their money from my panicked relatives. The situation was completely spiraling out of control for the people who always demanded absolute perfection. Brenda gripped the iron bars of the gate, refusing to let go, while tears of pure frustration and greedy desperation streamed down her flushed cheeks. She pressed her face against the cold, hard steel, trying to see past the lush green trees trying to catch a single tiny glimpse of the massive estate or the unimaginable wealth she had so foolishly thrown away. Valerie was completely sobbing now, sliding down the front of the heavy iron gate until she was sitting in the dirt on the hard cobblestone. Her ruined designer dress spread out around her like a dirty white puddle. She covered her ears with her sticky hands, trying desperately to block out the beautiful, joyful music playing from the reception just on the other side of the thick stone wall. The sound of my ultimate happiness was completely torturing her soul. The guards stepped forward, their expressions hard and entirely unforgiving, forming a solid human barricade between my toxic past and my beautiful, limitless future. They ordered my family to step back into the dusty street, making it absolutely clear that they were nothing more than unwanted strangers to me now. The family that had once sat around a heavy mahogany dining table making me feel incredibly small and completely alone was now standing on a dusty road, begging for entry into a beautiful world they would never ever belong to. While my family was busy being corralled like common trespassers by the armed security team outside the heavy iron gates. The atmosphere inside the sprawling estate was shifting into a beautiful, magical evening. The warm, golden hour sun began to dip below the lush green tree line, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns. The live string quartet was playing a soaring, triumphant melody, and the hundreds of elite guests were raising their crystal glasses in a final, joyous toast. Julian and I stood together near the center of the vast garden, surrounded by genuine friends and powerful allies who respected us completely. Julian gently took my hand and leaned in close to my ear, his dark eyes sparkling with a quiet, thrilling excitement. He softly told me that it was finally time for us to leave this beautiful celebration behind and officially begin our new life together. Just as he spoke those words, a low, powerful humming sound began to vibrate through the warm, evening air. The sound quickly grew louder and much more intense, echoing deeply across the sprawling $150 million estate. The billionaire guest smiled and took a few steps back, looking up into the clear August sky with deep admiration. Coming in fast from the southern horizon was a massive state-of-the-art, private luxury helicopter. Its sleek black exterior gleamed blindingly under the setting sun. The sheer size and power of the aircraft were absolutely breathtaking. It hovered gracefully over the center of the vast lawn, the immense force of its spinning rotor blades creating a beautiful swirling vortex of white flower petals all around us. The wind whipped through the delicate silk of my custom bridal gown, but I did not flinch. I just held tightly to the strong hand of my husband, feeling completely invincible. The noise of the descending helicopter easily breached the high stone walls of the estate and reached the dusty cobblestone street outside the main gates. The group of my toxic relatives stopped their frantic arguing and looked up in absolute terror and awe. Uncle David had to cover his ears against the deafening roar of the heavy rotors. Aunt Denise stared through the thick iron bars, her jaw completely unhinged as she watched the massive black helicopter touch down smoothly on the green grass, just a few hundred yards away from where they were standing. They had never seen anything so incredibly opulent in their entire lives. The cheap yellow city taxis parked behind them rattled and shook violently from the sheer aerodynamic force generated by the approaching aircraft. Valerie was still sitting in the dirt, crying hysterically into her sticky hands, but the deafening noise forced her to look up. She saw the sleek black helicopter through the iron gates, and a fresh wave of absolute agonizing humiliation washed over her entire body. She realized that while she was about to go home to a completely ruined life and a federal criminal, I was about to fly away into a limitless sky of unimaginable wealth and perfect happiness. Brenda stood frozen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The reality of the situation finally slammed into her greedy mind with full destructive force. The helicopter meant we were leaving. It meant the luxury party was over, and her only chance to manipulate her way into my massive fortune was literally about to fly away forever. Panic completely hijacked her nervous system. She knew her own smartphone was completely shattered on the docks, so she wildly lunged toward Valerie. She aggressively snatched the phone right out of the trembling hands of her golden child, completely ignoring the weak protests of Valerie. Brenda frantically unlocked the screen, her sweaty fingers slipping against the glass. She opened the text message application and pulled up my contact name. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely type the letters, but the desperate burning greed inside her forced her to focus. She needed to say something perfectly manipulative. She needed to invoke the sacred bond of family that she herself had relentlessly destroyed over the last 29 years. She desperately typed the words, trying to sound like a loving, concerned mother who just wanted to celebrate the happiest day of the life of her daughter. Out on the magnificent green lawn, the side door of the luxury helicopter slid open smoothly. A professional pilot wearing a crisp, dark uniform stepped out and offered a polite, highly respectful salute to Julian and me. Julian guided me forward, wrapping his arm protectively around my waist to shield me from the heavy wind of the rotors. We stepped up into the incredibly plush leather interior of the spacious aircraft. The cabin was completely soundproofed and heavily air-conditioned, offering an instant peaceful sanctuary from the noise outside. Julian sat down right next to me, securing my safety harness before buckling his own. Just as I settled into the luxurious leather seat, I felt a short, sharp vibration against my leg. I reached into the small hidden pocket of my silk bridal gown and pulled out my phone. The screen was brightly illuminated, showing a single new text message notification. I looked at the sender name, and a slow, calm smile spread across my face. It was a message from the phone of Valerie, but the desperate, manipulative tone of the words made it absolutely clear that it was actually my mother typing. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the short, pathetic sentence she had frantically sent. "Tessa, sweetheart, we are at the gates. Can we come in?" She actually had the absolute audacity to call me sweetheart. The same woman who had coldly ordered me to cancel my wedding to accommodate a fake white billionaire. The same woman who had stood at a heavy mahogany dining table and allowed my sister and my father to completely humiliate me. The same woman who had blindly worshipped a criminal and happily thrown me away like unwanted garbage was now standing in the dirt outside my massive estate, desperately begging for an invitation. She did not apologize for her abuse. She did not express any genuine remorse for the terrible pain she had caused me. She simply saw the massive helicopter, the armed guards, and the absolute confirmation of my $24 billion reality, and she wanted a piece of it. She thought a single fake term of endearment could easily erase a lifetime of severe emotional neglect. Julian leaned over his broad shoulder, brushing softly against mine. He looked down at the bright screen of my phone, reading the pathetic message from my mother. He did not look angry or defensive. He simply looked at me with deep, unconditional trust, waiting to see exactly how I wanted to handle the final pathetic ghost of my toxic past. He knew he had given me the ultimate secure fortress, and now it was entirely up to me to lock the heavy doors. I looked out the reinforced glass window of the luxury helicopter. Through the massive ancient trees lining the long, sweeping driveway, I could just barely see the imposing wrought iron gates in the distance. I could see the tiny flashing lights of the yellow taxis and the small clustered figures of the relatives who had tried so desperately to destroy my peace. They looked incredibly small. They looked entirely insignificant. The heavy, crushing power they used to hold over my mind and my fragile self-esteem was completely gone. I did not feel a single ounce of anger toward them anymore. I did not feel sad or bitter or vengeful. I simply felt absolutely nothing for them at all. They were complete strangers to me now. I looked back down at my phone, resting my thumbs on the digital keyboard. I did not type a long emotional paragraph explaining how much they had hurt me. I did not list their terrible crimes or demand a proper apology. Explaining your pain to people who are completely committed to misunderstanding you is a massive waste of precious energy. I owed them absolutely nothing. With complete serenity and a profoundly light heart, I typed exactly 2 words in response to the desperate begging of my mother. Too late. I hit the send button, and watched the small green bubble appear on the screen. I did not wait for a frantic reply. I immediately tapped on the contact profile of Valerie and pressed the block caller button. I scrolled down my contact list and did the exact same thing for my mother, my father, Uncle David, Aunt Denise, and every single toxic relative who had blindly participated in the vicious smear campaign against me. One by one, I permanently severed the digital ties to my abusive history. I locked them out of my life, my mind, and my beautiful future forever. I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I turned to Julian and gave him a bright, radiant smile. "It is done," I told him softly, my voice completely steady and entirely free. He smiled back, reaching over to gently take my hand in his. He gave the pilot a simple nod, and the massive helicopter engines roared with incredible power. I felt the sudden thrilling sensation of weightlessness as the heavy aircraft smoothly lifted off the manicured green lawn. We ascended rapidly into the beautiful, clear August sky, leaving the sprawling estate and the hundreds of cheering billionaire guests far below us. I looked out the window one last time as we banked gracefully toward the bright setting sun. The massive iron gates grew smaller and smaller until the pathetic, desperate figures of my family completely disappeared into the shadows of the trees. They were trapped down there in the dark, dusty reality of their own terrible choices, while I was soaring higher than they could ever possibly reach. If you are listening to this right now, and you are currently holding on to a toxic family simply because you share the same biological blood, you need to hear this absolute truth. Blood does not make a family. Blood makes you related. Unconditional love, mutual respect, and fiercely protecting the peace of one another is what truly makes a family. Do not ever let people treat you like a disposable option and then expect you to treat them like a massive priority. Do not let the loud, aggressive voices of deeply insecure people dictate your incredible worth. Setting firm boundaries with the people who raised you is the most painful and terrifying thing you will ever do in your entire life. Society constantly tells us that we must blindly forgive our parents and siblings, no matter how severely they abuse us. But you do not owe your future happiness to the people who actively try to destroy your present peace. Walking away from toxicity is not an act of bitter revenge. It is an act of profound self-preservation. It is the beautiful, necessary process of creating a healthy, empty space so that true love, genuine support, and unimaginable success can finally enter your life. My family thought they were burying me when they abandoned me on my wedding day, but they completely forgot that I was a seed. They pushed me into the dirt, and I grew into an absolute unstoppable force. I found a partner who honors my brilliant mind and fiercely protects my heart. I found a beautiful new family completely built on trust and absolute equality. And I left the people who desperately tried to break me, stranded on the absolute outside of my incredible life. If this story resonated with your own personal journey of healing and overcoming toxic family dynamics, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I would love to read your stories in the comments below, so please tell me about a time you had to set a massive boundary to protect your own peace. You are never alone in this fight for your own happiness. Thank you for listening to my truth today. And always remember, your peace is absolutely priceless. Do not ever let anyone bankrupt your soul.